You're here with Dennis Ramundi and my co-host Phil Goldberg, author of American Veda. Our show, Spirit Matters Talk, spiritmatterstalk.com. Our guest today on our podcast, Kurt Johnson. He is a well-known internationally as a scientist, comparative religionist, social activist, and former monastic. He has a Ph.D. in evolution, ecology, systematics, and comparative biology, plus extensive training in comparative religion and philosophy. He was associated professionally for 20 years with the American Museum of Natural History in New York and One Spirit Interfaith Seminary in New York City. His book, The Coming Interspiritual Age. Kurt, thank you so very much for taking the time to come on our podcast today.
Oh, thank you.
Kurt, this is Phil. You've had one of the more interesting backgrounds of all the people I know in the spiritual communities. Your broad arc is monk, scientist, interspiritual activist. Could you give us a kind of overview of what brought you to the current work you do today and the significant influences in your past?
Yeah, as I mentioned in another recent chat, I think, as we're dealing in a world that's going global and going multicultural and going multidisciplinary with regard to problem solving, no doubt about it, that there's more and more people and more value on people who've come from these, broad backgrounds in which they've also, met certain levels of expertise. There was certainly a time in my life where those various facets didn't seem coherent, and I used to wonder, why am I existentially drawn to all of these different fields? And I've really reached a pretty good bar of excellence in all of those fields, and sometimes it didn't make sense. But now, particularly in the global arena and the work I do at the UN, it makes perfect sense. So that's really kind of it. I think I was driven, like all of us, by what I was drawn to personally and existentially, and that was a broad base of things across science, the humanities, and then the spiritual traditions.
Wait. I wanted to ask you, Kurt, about your background as a monk. You lived in a monastery. I think it was an Anglican seminary or monastery. What brought you into the monastery, and what was life like in there?
Well, it's interesting. I was a very highly wired graduate student, just into my first Ph.D. program when I made that turn. That was in the late 60s. I think that existentially, I knew that if I didn't look at things in the internal level, I certainly wasn't going to have an idea of either who I was or what the world was. So I just made that abrupt turn in the middle of graduate school by having a professor who also was from a Benedictine background, and I admired his stability, and I admired his broad view of what everything was about. So I made that detour, finished my doctorate actually when I was with that order. And then fortunately, actually, long story short, when I was asked to leave because I was really too trans-traditional for that particular order, it was perfect timing because I ended up not only having a really wonderful job at the Natural History Museum, but also meeting all the other people that were doing interspirituality, who'd also, they either were still in their orders or they'd been asked to leave their orders or whatever the case may be.
Wayne, Kurt, one of the people who had a big influence on you and with whom you were very close was Brother Wayne Teasdale, whom many of our listeners may know about or whose books they may have read. Can you tell us about Brother Wayne and his impact on your life?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I met Brother Wayne shortly after coming out of the monastic life myself and being in New York City. And I had read his book, The Mystic Heart. I realized that our backgrounds, which were, contemplative, even non-dual Christian contemplative experience, and then Advaita Vedanta, which at that time was my other deep root path, which was then followed by others. But we really connected about that similar grounding and also his vision in the mystic heart that there was a universal spirituality that was being discovered in the world's religions. That was the subtitle of his book. And so that connection was instant. We talked all night one night in a hotel in New York, and after that we formed an association together, which became what's now really the interspirituality.com and what's kind of commonly called the interspiritual movement. So you couldn't know Brother Wayne without being profoundly influenced by him. I mean, he was a man of incredible presence, incredible humility, and incredible drive toward this vision that world religions needed to become part of the solution and not just remain part of the problem. So that was an ongoing close relationship up until his passing in 2004. We had just done a program together at the Parliament of World Religions where he had been too ill to attend, and the rest of us had done it without him. So that's that in a nutshell. But all of us who knew him, for instance, if you look at interspirituality.com on the programs page, where Phil is listed among many others, almost all of those people were people who were deeply, personally motivated by Wayne Teasdale, and then formed the core of that, of what that is now.
Kurt, explain to us a little bit about how you came to non-duality in Christianity, and how you explain that concept to Christians.
Yeah, I think that's pretty simple, actually, is that when anyone inquires at the depth of who we are existentially, experientially, you end up having the experience that you're not separate. So I think, what's called the awakening experience or the non-dual experience is really, in that sense, that elegantly simple, that you realize existentially and in your gut, in your whole experience, that everything is profoundly interconnected, nothing is separate, and in that, you're not separate. And then that has profound implications for the way that you need to be and the way that you need to live. So I think that really puts it in a nutshell, aside from whatever tradition you had that experience in.
Do you find, because I do, sometimes resistance from people who are in not just Christianity, but the Western traditions in general, who value their separateness from God? That is, their path is centered around the transcendence of God and the ability to feel devotion to something not themselves. And there's a kind of misunderstanding of non-duality that people think that excludes that kind of devotional I and thou experience. Do you find that?
Yeah, and the truth of the matter is that all of these things are simultaneously true. So the most transcendent person is also going to understand simultaneously that in this crazy multiplicity of oneness and multiplicity, what's playing together is both, and the word paradox, both things of equal glory, of the oneness and the separateness. And if you look at the yin-yang symbol and you look at all of that type of symbolism, this is about the balance of that simultaneity. So the good news, you can have the best of both worlds. You can have your cake and eat it too. And I think after that, it's a matter of calling. In the yogas, for instance, if you ask people if they're more jnani, which would be, let's say, more about the oneness, or more bhakti, which more about the tangential experience of devotion to something, all of those things are simultaneously real, and they're simultaneously all valid. Then the question is, what in each of us is our tendency?
Right.
I think that some people have started out more in the devotional, and then they've balanced it more with the transcendent, and then others it's been the other way, where they've been very transcendent, and then they've balanced that then down the line with the devotional. So they always say that the secret of non-duality is simultaneity, that everything is true simultaneously.
Right.
Kurt, in your work in interfaith work, working with religions, I'm wondering about Christianity. I mean, I have a Catholic background, and basically, if you buy into everything you're taught in Catholicism, It's that everyone else in the world should be also Catholic. And that's really your mission, to get everyone. Not every Catholic believes that, or certainly works in that direction, but that's what you're being taught. And I'm sure some of the other more fundamentalist sects of Christianity are also like that. How does that play into, how does it work when you're dealing with folks like that?
Well, I think what one has to see is that these are different developmental levels of how a religion is being acted out. That just as a species, just even anthropologically, we've been very head-oriented. We've been very dualistic. We've been very mental. And the whole process now of us as a species dropping out of the mentality, which is about creeds and dogmas and ideologies and parties and nations and all these identity-based allegiances, that's gradually giving way now to this, world-centric, global-centric, multicultural type of thing, which very often people call the second-tier consciousness. Mm-hmm. And in that, what happens that there's less of an allegiance to the mental ideas which separate, and more of an allegiance to the things in the heart, which bring things together. So I think that's what's happening. There's a dropping out of the head and into the heart. Some of it's by realization itself, and some by just driven by the pragmatics of the world situation. But that's what's happening. So most people, yes, that they've identified with an idea, a flag, a country, a national anthem, a religion. And yet now, particularly if you talk to millennials, their experience is very different. They're not seeing these boxes. They're not seeing these divisions as primary.
Right. Let me just
our generation did.
Follow up on that slightly. So if that's the case, and many people now, and Phil and I talk about this often, consider themselves spiritual but not religious. What's the role of religion then? Why can't we have a world where we move towards people growing in spirituality, but religion and the different types of religion not being necessary? What is their role?
Yeah, I think this is the gigantic future question. I was just on a call with Ed Bastian, who founded Spiritual Paths with Father Thomas Keating, and we were just having that conversation. Once religion is not about fears and about identities, and once it's into pure spirituality, then the question is, what do people do together? And what is meaningful for people to do together? Now, you can define religion just really as what people do together. What do they talk about? What do they put into words and images? What rituals do they do, or ceremonies that are meaningful to them? This is a gigantic question as this world goes multicultural and more, trans-traditional. So we're really just at the beginning of that grand experiment. It's exciting.
Speaking of which, Kurt, that's a good segue to the term interspiritual. You've written a book, The Coming Interspiritual Age. You've mentioned the term interspiritual. We've had people like Mirabai Starr on the program where the term has been used. Since you're the author or co-author of a book with the word in the title, perhaps you could define it and explain how it's different from the common usage interfaith.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think we have to assume that the world is going global and it's going multicultural. And if we're living in a harmonious global civilization that is multicultural, we're going to be dropping out of the idea of divisions that are in our mental ideas and our creeds and dogmas, more into the world of the heart, the world of resonance and love and kindness, mutuality, everything all the great teachers have taught about. And that becomes more the currency of what spirituality is doing than the more mental things. So actually what interspirituality is that if you looked at interfaith as the dialogue of somewhat fixed positions of different human experiences, there's one way this is talked about sometimes, that all world religions are senses of meaning, and over time they've become lineages of meaning. Now, if you're then having relationships across those lineages of meaning at a deeper level, where people are realizing, my gosh, we're not separate. It doesn't matter race, color, or creed. We're all, people of this globe. We're people of Gaia, the ecosystem. Suddenly, there's a new gestalt that comes in there. So really, that's what really interspirituality is. It's asking people to drop down into that deeper heart place or that unity consciousness place, and then relate from there, so that their differences, their ethnic roots, their backgrounds are secondary, but they're being together right here, right now, in presence and love and caring, that's primary. So that transition seems to be happening across the higher developmental levels of all the world's religions. I mean, you can look at Islam, for instance, and at the highest level of development, you'd have Rumi, who in the West is the most popular poet for everybody. And yet at the lower levels of development, where everything is separate and threatening, then you have ISIS. So it's really a matter of development and maturity.
I think that's...
Let me follow up on that for a sec, Dennis. As I understand it, one of the things that characterizes interspirituality is a sense of people being able to learn and grow and draw from traditions outside their own to enrich their own spirituality. Have you seen that as a trend, and is it more commonplace among the young?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Now, what Wayne Teasdale called that was wisdom resources, that all the riches that all the traditions bring are wisdom resources. And right now, in a globalizing world, all of them are on the table to be experienced by people and used for their own awakening and their own living. And there's for instance, when I spoke at Science and Non-Duality, I asked everyone in the room, how many use more than one practice, more than two, more than three, more than four? Every hand went up in the room. And I'll tell you, that would not have been true 5 years ago.
No, certainly not.
So that now, because of the internet and because of openness and just this growing global understanding, is just phenomenally more common. So that's why this term now for interspirituality, multiple belonging, I love that term. I think it's maybe the best term that's evolved for interspirituality is multiple belonging. Be at home with all of these contexts and all of these rich traditions and ways of celebrating being here.
Kurt, as one evolves spiritually, or as a group evolves spiritually, do they take on new responsibilities? And I ask that because I know you're familiar with, and I'd like you to discuss the term eco-spirituality and how that fits into a spiritual person's responsibility.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I was just going to mention, just as an aside, actually, even one reason I'm talking rather briskly here is because this is such a rich topic that the more that one can sneak in that kind of titillates how people think about this or feel about it, so important. So one of the huge separations that's broken down, I'll say particularly in the last 5 years, is that when people realize that everything's profoundly interconnected, this old dualism of man and nature, or I'm here and it's there, or this is headquarters in my body and I'm looking out at this external environment, this starts to fade away. And when people start to realize the interconnections of the quantum reality, even when they start to hear or understand about the new physics and all of that, they suddenly realize, oh my gosh, we are completely intertwined with our environment. Our body is made up of those things, salt water, all the trace elements. We're putting those elements into ourselves when we eat. We're breathing in, in every few, seconds. So this amount of intimacy, I want to just use that term, intimacy with our environment, couldn't be closer. So what happened is that the stories that we were told by, let's say, post-European Enlightenment, Industrial Revolution, consumer-driven society about exploitation of nature and it serving us and our dominion over it, that is a gigantic transition now that's changing to this understanding not only of the interconnection, but actually of the organismic nature of the ecosphere itself, as Gaia or whatever you want to call it, that this is a profoundly interconnected quantum system, and people are getting that. So the two conversations now aren't separate anymore. They're profoundly interconnected. So you get Wayne Teasdale then side by side with Thomas Berry, who, of course, Berry came off of Teilhard, the great cosmologist in Catholicism, who was one of the first people to talk about this. So, yeah.
Kurt, that's just for the sake of listeners, we are actually recording this while the summit climate summit in Paris is going on. People will hear this subsequent to the Paris talks, but how do you see, given the moment of crisis we're in with respect to climate change and the environment in general, I know you and some of your colleagues have been deeply involved in this. How do you see the linkage between the action that has to be taken and spirituality and consciousness, or the sort of inner dimension of this crisis, and how it translates into action?
Yeah, here's the interesting thing, is that it's almost a race against time, it would seem, to see whether this growing awareness of the interconnection, which so often comes from the deeper visceral experience, which we might call spirituality, and that awareness, that's what has created all of these crises and challenges, from resource scarcity to biodiversity to climate change and all this. Is there going to be a response from humanity at the level of creating the civil will to create the political will for structural changes that can start to work against the abuse of the ecosystem before it's too late? And so I think this is one of the biggest questions now that's going on, is that the entrenched power elites and the entrenched people in the old story, who either believe that these crises aren't real. For instance, there was an incredibly dynamic, bombastic editorial in the New York Post completely calling everything that's going on in Paris as just poppycock nonsense by crazy liberals who are out to do whatever. And, that paper is read by millions and millions of people. So on the one hand, you have no awareness, and on the other hand, you have this drive toward awareness that says basically this, that if you don't link this new awareness to policy, we're probably going to have a catastrophe on our hands. So certainly what's going on in Paris is an attempt to link this awareness to the civil will and the political will toward policy change. And that I think is the big question. And a lot of the people at the UN who, let's say, have signed on to the new Sustainable Development Goals agenda, which was in September, they'll say across the table to you, I'm with you on this, but I don't know how I can sell it at home. And that would be like 176 delegates from 176 different nations, large and small, that they'll say that. I'm with you, but I don't know how I can sell this at home.
Mm-hmm. Kurt, the current Pope is a part of that conference. How significant is he to interfaith dialogue and activity and to eco-spirituality?
Well, it's huge. I mean, it's absolutely huge, because no one would have ever expected, after Benedict, who was really, let's say, the enforcer of the Department of Doctrine in the Vatican, that then you'd get a Francis who, coming out of liberation theology background in South America, had this other awareness. That has been, in a sense, we use the term, a godsend and a big surprise. Actually, this article in the New York Post said that we were just about to get rid of Al Gore. We thought we'd neutralized him, and now we've got this crazy Pope to deal with.
Oh my God.
So, it's huge, because the gravitas of the Pope is huge, whether you agree with him or not. As a Roman Catholic, he is the Pope. So, I mean, we know that there are dioceses that are actively working against his agenda. That's just the politics of it all. But, I mean, what an amazing surprise, right?
Right. I mean,
but again, that we get back to the question of developmental levels, and maybe you can elaborate a little bit about that for our listeners. I know you've been associated with Ken Wilber, and you've drawn on some of his research. Maybe you can give us an overview of what is meant by developmental levels in the context of spirituality.
Yeah, I think the easiest way is by two examples. If you looked at Pope Benedict, he would have been at the developmental level of literalist. So his devotion to doctrine overall, as opposed to a larger view of all persons, all peoples, all cultures, he was at that level, which is about, let's say, level number 5. Now, if you come in with Francis, and Francis would be at what you'd call the integral, he'd be at like pluralistic integral. He's up at that higher level, 6 or 7, where his immediate attention goes to the needs of the whole and what concerns all cultures, all people, and not just his doctrine. You can actually see that in his work so far, he's steered back and forth. He's very realistic about what he can't change right now and what he can change. So he works toward the things he can't change, and he's more slow about the things that he can't change. The other example, real quick, I mentioned before, would be in Islam. Now, at archaic, which is I'm right, you're wrong, and I'll kill you because you don't agree with me, that's ISIS. That's Islam at the archaic level. But if you take Islam and you run it up to the integral level, well, that's Rumi. And who hasn't listened to Coleman Barks read Rumi and just been in ecstasy?
Mm-hmm. And in between, you will have all kinds of different variations within the Muslim community, just as you would within the Christian community, because there would be many levels below the one you described for Pope Benedict.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, yeah, the general levels they're different with different systems, but archaic to magic to mythic to rational to pluralistic to integral and then to super integral. You know, when we talk about awakened consciousness and people who just love everyone because they're so awake in the heart, that would be super integral, where just your nature, just who you are as a person goes to love and service and oneness and doesn't think about identities or differences. Yeah, so even that difference between integral and super integral is interesting, because you could get integral mentally and you could then be acting on that as your, let's say, your worldview. But even that's slightly different than having it be who you are.
Right.
Kurt, are there specific spiritual tools, activities that you participate in every day?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we all realize, you know, Ken Wilber talks about this being a combination of what he calls waking up and growing up. So spiritual practice is actually the waking up part. It's different for every person. But that's the real, you know, real visceral, deep, highly personal, just it's about connection, it's about devotion, you know, love, interconnection. And then the other part, the growing up part, is the knowledge part. You know, how do you take that and you actually build societies and structures and other things? So, for instance, in the Heart Sutra actually has 2 parts. First part is about wisdom. Second part's about skillful means. So it's really that, again, that yin and yang, that, you know, that combination.
Kurt, I want to go back to a term you mentioned earlier in the context of interspirituality and people resisting the identification with a single religious tradition. You use the term multiple belonging, which sounds really intriguing. Here's the question. One of the things the conventional religions do well is provide places for people to go and communities for people to belong to. And one of the things that this new cohort of people who are interspiritual or call themselves spiritual but not religious and so forth often find missing is that sense of community and place, especially when they have children. What is happening in your observations to perhaps make up for that lack of community? Are communities being established that would be interspiritual, for example?
Yeah, they are, and the reason is as we point out in our book, and it's true in every developmental book, that, you know, when there's a paradigm shift, and you can look at any revolution of any kind worldwide in history, then there's a period of experimentation afterwards about what are the structures of the way people are together that express that new paradigm as opposed to the old paradigm. And that's a very dicey, perilous period where many types of models are experimented with. Some work better than others, some don't work at all, and so on. So exactly that, you know, people who are in this larger now, trans-traditional or trans-narrative as they call it, they're asking that very question. They're asking, what is meaningful now for communities of people that share this worldview? what do those people do together? Because they realized that an awful lot of traditional religion, when you were dealing with people that had daily jobs and they're busy, was really catering to the existential fears with regard to health and death, and all of the rites of passage were really reassuring people, or as the Bishop of Sweden recently said at a conference, it was about giving comfort.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what does religion do when it's not about giving comfort anymore, because everyone's already spiritually comfortable?
Mm-hmm.
So the point is, many communities now are trying to experiment with what that would look like. There's
Mm-hmm.
integral churches, interspiritual churches. Let's hope for the best.
It's like that old joke of the angel going to God and saying, there's this Satan character down on earth wreaking havoc, and oh no, it's the opposite. I'm sorry. It's Satan. Somebody going to Satan and say, "There's this Jesus guy down there, and he could be trouble for us." And Satan says, "Well, if he gets any bigger, he's going to have to organize, and then he'll be on our side."
One final question from my side, Kurt, is somebody listening in. It's very that's inspired by what's being said. Especially in the spiritual growth towards non-duality, but they feel that they're not growing in that direction and they would like to. What would you recommend to them?
Well, I think, they should take a look at the international website, interspirituality.com, because that really portrays the grander array of started with 100 different organizations worldwide that really are operating from this more trans-traditional point of view. It tells you who those people are. It links you into what they're doing. You can also go to what's called the Interspiritual Multiplex, which is www.isdna, for Interspiritual Dialogue and Action, isdna.org. And that's a huge website. It's an older website, but again, it tells you what everyone's doing worldwide, geographically as well, with this new worldview.
Great.
And they can get your book, The Coming Interspiritual Age.
Coming Interspiritual Age, and new book coming out soon, Fine Lines, is that right?
Yeah, it's a book on how genius works in science and the arts. That's why it's called Fine Lines. Very fine line between artistic genius and scientific genius.
Great.
That's the Yale University Press, probably February.
What else is on your cutting edge, Kurt?
Well, working with all you guys, there's a large community out there who all share this, what they call trans narrative, and we're all trying to do things together. I'm doing a ton of stuff with Shift Network and a ton of stuff with Gaia Field Network, and so that's what we're trying to do, is just create more and more networks of this new worldview.
Great. Kurt, thank you so much for your time. Congratulations on the work you're doing, and good luck on the work you will continue to do. And I hope you can come back on the show sometime soon and we can talk some more.
Well, thank you guys so much. It was really great to have the chat.
Thanks, Kurt.
Thank you.
Yeah, Phil, got lots of love.
Bye-bye.